Imagine America. It's still a pretty young nation, right? And it's suddenly swept up in this massive wave of change. I mean, transformation so big, it didn't just tweak daily life. It fundamentally remade the economy, the social structure, really the whole idea of what being American meant.
Mm.
We're talking about a time when, everything from how you earned your keep to how families worked was just completely turned on its head. Okay, so let's dive deep into this key period. It's known as the Market Revolution, roughly 1800 to 1848. Our goal today is to pull out the really crucial insights from, well, a bunch of sources, articles, research, historical accounts. They paint a vivid picture of how new tech, farming methods, and commerce just upended American life.
Exactly. And for you listening, we want to boil this down into, understandable chunks. We'll look at the huge population shifts, the rise of totally new social classes, how older ways of making a living started fading, and how family and gender roles were shifting too. The market revolution wasn't just about money changing hands. It was maybe America's first big lesson in, well, the paradox of industrial progress. You get more efficiency, new chances, sure, but often at the cost of older community bonds. And it's really the birth of modern economic inequality. It's a story with roots that definitely still resonate today.
It really is. This wasn't just like a minor economic boom. The market revolution was this powerful engine connecting northern factories with farms out west and in the south. And it was all driven by these incredible leaps in farming, manufacturing, and crucially, transportation. It really forged a lot of the institutions we still see.
Right. And what's key here is seeing how these economic changes cause this ripple effect across the whole society. We need to look beyond just the buying and selling. It fundamentally reshaped how Americans saw them and their relationship to work, to their neighbors, even their own families. Life got faster, more interconnected in some ways, but maybe more fragmented for individuals too.
And that's exactly why understanding this period is so important for you. It gives you a clear view into where many of our current social structures and maybe even some pensions actually started. It's like finding the source of a river that's still flowing through our lives now. Okay, so one of the clearest ways this revolution showed up was just people moving, lots of people. This is where America really becomes a nation on the move. We're talking huge numbers moving within the country, but also a massive wave of people coming from overseas. All this feeding the growth and the diversification of cities, especially in the North and the West. Yeah, take cities like Philadelphia. They just exploded, both in size and, well, culturally. A lot of that was driven by Irish and German immigrants coming in large numbers. And the reasons they came, well, they tell a story of hardship but also hope. For the Irish, it was dominated by the potato famine in the mid-1800s, just devastating hunger, forcing millions out.
Terrible situation.
Right. And then many Germans, they were maybe farmers pushed out by bad harvests, or people disillusioned after those failed democratic revolutions back home in 1848, looking for a fresh start.
And the numbers, they really show this upheaval. You go from maybe 150,000 immigrants in the 1820s to, get this, 1.7 million in the 1840s.
Wow.
It's a huge jump. And this wasn't just numbers. It was people providing, frankly, a pool of cheap labor that industry needed. But it also brought real challenges. Cities got overcrowded fast. That stirred up class tensions. And it changed the look and feel of cities, too, with new things like Catholic churches and synagogues popping up, which was, pretty new for a lot of Americans at the time.
And it wasn't only the East Coast feeling this. You had Americans and some immigrants, too, pushing west, setting up brand new, booming communities along the big rivers like the Ohio and the Mississippi. Places that were wilderness just, became hubs almost overnight. Like Cincinnati, its nickname was Porkopolis.
Right, Porkopolis.
Because of its huge meatpacking industry. It sounds funny, but it shows how river transport plus industrial processing could create these thriving cities west of the Appalachians. And St. Louis, too, booming as a Mississippi river port. It was connecting all that western farm output to the rest of the country, even the world, a real gateway for moving west.
But this flood of diverse people, especially Catholics and Jews who weren't the Protestant majority, it had a dark side too.
Yeah.
You definitely saw a backlash. This rise of nativism in the 1830s, 1840s, it wasn't just quiet prejudice. It became an organized political thing, playing on fears about cultural change and job competition.
So looking at the big picture of migration then, it really set up this dynamic for America. On one hand, it was the fuel for growth. But on the other, it kicked off these deep debates about who belongs, about national identity, that honestly we're still having today. It made people ask, who are we when we keep changing? And speaking of shifts, while people were redrawing the map physically, the whole foundation of economic and social life was shifting too, creating completely new ways to live and dividing society in ways that hadn't really been seen before. The market revolution, Yeah, it changed economic structures dramatically. Some people definitely got more prosperous, living standards rose for some, but it also created these really sharp social divisions. All of a sudden, you see new social classes starting to harden, like an emerging middle class. It showed up first and most clearly in the North. These weren't the old landed gentry. This was a new group: businessmen, shopkeepers, journalists, doctors, lawyers. And they set themselves apart not just by income, but by specific norms emphasizing education, temperance, being Protestant mostly.
And leisure time.
Right. They had money for leisure, going to plays, circuses, sporting events. That was new for a big chunk of society.
But what's interesting, and often missed, is that this middle class wasn't entirely white, even with all the racism. There's this book by Joseph Wilson from 1841, Sketches of the Higher Classes of Colored Society in Philadelphia. It gives you this fascinating window into a black middle class emerging in northern cities. It shows that, prosperity, education, distinct social habits, they weren't only white things. It adds a layer of complexity. And then at the very top, you had this tiny but super wealthy business elite created by all this industrial wealth. Think of places like the Philadelphia Club, started in the 1830s, kind of symbols of this widening gap between rich and poor. And then there were the people doing the hard labor, the laboring poor. Despite the wealth being generated, a huge and growing part of the population was stuck with really low wages, working like 12 or 13 hours a day in dangerous conditions.
Grueling work. Yeah. But this hardship, it wasn't just accepted quietly. It sparked some of the first organized resistance. You see it really clearly with the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association. This was organized in 1844 by women working in the mills. They were demanding shorter days, better conditions.
Right, they weren't just asking nicely.
No, it was a powerful collective voice coming right off the factory floor. A really early example of labor activism, tied up with both class and gender. And even earlier, 1829 in Philadelphia, you had the Working Men's Party, a political party. Pushing for things like free public schools, shorter hours, better conditions. It shows class-based politics becoming a real thing in the U.S.
And if you connect that forward, these early fights, they weren't just, small local disputes. They really laid the groundwork for the whole labor rights movement. They feed directly into the debates we still have about economic inequality, worker safety, the government's role in business. It's a straight line from those 1840s factories to today's discussions about, say, a living wage or corporate accountability.
Now, this whole transformation wasn't just happening in cities or creating new classes. It fundamentally changed how most Americans actually earned a living. The market revolution meant a huge move away from the old ways, from traditional farming where you mostly fed yourself, towards working for wages and making things for faraway markets.
Exactly. More and more Americans, men and women, stopped relying mainly on their own small farms. Instead, they supported their families by making goods for people they'd never meet, earning wages. This industrial capitalism, it totally reshaped how people made a living. It pulled many off the land, plugged them into this bigger, more impersonal system, which, raises a big question. What happened to Jefferson's ideal? That vision of America built on independent small farmers.
Right.
This era, in a lot of ways, was the beginning of the end for that ideal as the dominant reality.
It's just a fundamental shift in how people lived, worked, saw their place. And it connects directly to how most of us earn a living today. That move from self-sufficiency to being part of this giant market. That legacy is still deeply embedded in our economy. Okay, so now let's get into how all this economic upheaval reached into the most personal parts of life, family and gender roles. This is where the market revolution created some of its most enduring and maybe most complicated legacies, especially with the rise of what's called the cult of domesticity. This is a really powerful idea pushed hard through all the new books and magazines. It basically said a woman's main place, her identity, her purpose, was in the home.
The private sphere.
Exactly. Raising kids, being the moral center, making the home a sort of haven of rest for her husband who was out battling in the rough public world of business. It drew these really clear lines: public world for men, private world for women.
What's fascinating, though, is that this cult of domesticity was overwhelmingly a middle-class thing, an ideal. And it often hid the tough economic facts for many families. Even reformers like Lydia Maria Child, who pushed for women's education, still pretty much reinforced these ideas of separate spheres. But for huge numbers of working-class women, staying home just wasn't an option. They had to work. Their families needed the money. They worked in factories, on farms, often in really harsh conditions.
Right. The reality for so many women was totally different from that ideal. They couldn't afford to be delicate homemakers.
Yeah.
Think about those young women from New England farms who went to work in the Lowell
The
mills.
Lowell Mill women, yeah.
They lived in tightly controlled boarding houses, earned very little for those 12, 13-hour days. And their activism, like starting that labor reform association, wasn't just about money. It was this powerful statement from women who were living outside that domestic ideal because they had to. It showed a growing awareness of class and gender.
And yet, even with these strong pressures, some women did find ways to get some economic independence. There's a story of Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake. They were a same-sex couple in Vermont who ran a successful tailoring business together.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it's a great example. It shows that even in this restrictive time, women could find niches, create financial autonomy, and build lives that didn't fit the standard mold. Their success kind of points to the cracks in that whole separate spheres idea.
So what's the takeaway for you here? The market revolution created these strong ideals about men's and women's roles. But at the same time, the economic realities forced many women into very different lives. And that tension between the ideal and the reality, it really set up ongoing debates about work, family, equality, debates that are still very much alive and changing today. We've covered a lot of ground here, just an incredible period of change in this deep dive. We've looked at the huge population movements that remade communities, the birth of really distinct social and economic classes, the big shift away from farming as the main way of life, and those deep changes in family roles in society.
So, if we step back, what does it all mean? The market revolution wasn't just, a series of economic events. It was more like a crucible. It fundamentally reshaped America's character. It laid down the basic code, you could say, for many of the institutions, the opportunities, and also the persistent tensions we see in the U.S. today. It really forged a new kind of nation. And this brings us to a final thought for you to maybe chew on. How does that push and pull we saw back then between economic change, social identity, individual roles, how does that still play out today? Can you see echoes of these 19th century changes in our current debates? Things like immigration policy, fights for workers' rights, the gap between rich and poor, or even just how we talk about gender and family.
Yeah, I really encourage you to think about those connections, to see how deep these historical roots go, maybe even in your own life, your own community. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into the huge changes of the market revolution. We hope you feel a bit more connected to the forces that shaped and will continue to shape America.